We acknowledge the Ancient Ones, the Greater Shamanic Council of Light, Hermes, Thoth, Trismegistus, and Seshet, Lady of the Measuring Cord, as above, so below, as within, so without. We acknowledge Imhotep, Architect of the Cosmos. May the earth be the mirror of heaven. We acknowledge the Sacred Order of the Magi, and all throughout history who knew, like now, a turning of the ages. We acknowledge the Master Builders of Göbekli Tepe and the Great Shining Ones at Kalash. The courage and knowledge of the Polynesian wayfinders traversing the great oceans. We acknowledge the prophetic traditions of Ezekiel and Daniel, the traditions of Avalon, the Merlin, and the Round Table, the calendric wizardry of the Maya, and the Venus teachings from Mesoamerica, the Jupiter teachings originating in China, and the Vedic lunar mansion traditions, the Babylonian and Sumerian sidereal zodiacs, the brilliant Hellenistic invention of the seasonal zodiac. The Neolithic peoples around the planet, some still today, honoring the sacred connection between the land and the sky. The Tuatha De Danann in Ireland, who created a time of 2,000 years of peace, the builders of Newgrange. My teachers that are not in human form, Mount Shasta, the Grandfather Rock at the Wonderland of Rocks in Joshua Tree, Mount Haleakala on Maui, the Fish Lake Valley, Hierophany, and the sacred landscapes around the planet, the astrosophy of Rudolf Steiner, and the esoteric astrology of DK in the Tibetan, both presaging the shamanic astrology paradigm, and particularly the archetypal visions of C.G. Jung and the cosmology of my mentor, Dane Rajar. For these and more we give thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is Vlogcast number 3. I'm Daniel Giamario, the creator of the Shamanic Astrology Paradigm, co-founder of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. And we have quite an exploration today. What a time we're in. And each of these monthly vlogcasts is going to feature different important people in our school. And helping out on today's vlogcast is Mary Kern, the president of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, and Awen, who I like to call Skywatcher, Awen Skywatcher, who is our treasurer and managing director trainee right now. And they're going to help me on today's investigation. A lot to cover. In fact, what it is we need to cover today is going to take place over 2 vlogcasts. And so this is the first of them that I wanted to make sure you all had a chance to hear before the amazing events of the December solstice and the exact Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius that's happening at that time. There was an introduction to what we're going to talk about today in a Facebook post a few days ago. And I'd like to go through that with you all here first. And that will introduce, I think, some of our main themes that I want to get across here. The main themes that we want to get across are, what does it mean to enter into the Age of Aquarius? And how that just connects with the foundational elements of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School. The Jupiter-Saturn Great Mutation. What is that all about? And then also, because we want to get this in before Christmas, and this will be the vlog before Christmas, we want to talk about that extremely fascinating issue that a lot of people are talking about these days, which is, was there an astronomical and or astrological phenomena that was the Christmas star? And so that'll all be covered here today, but some of the deeper rabbit holes that one goes down in talking about the Jupiter-Saturn pattern, going back thousands and thousands of years, the so-called Great Mutation, will involve a bit more extensive work, and we'll kind of feature some of the deep dive into that in volume 2 of this. So let's take a look at that Facebook post, and we'll go through that together and have a little bit of discussion about it. I say the dawning of the Age of Aquarius. What again? This is the title, and anyway, it's in this eclipse season. The subject has been of great interest to me all the way back to the 1980s. And there have been in these past weeks numerous articles, presentations concerning the upcoming conjunction. Actually, let me stop for a moment and share something here. What inspired me to even get back into this at this point is something I received. It was by email, and it's someone who I really respect a lot, but sent out a newsletter saying, "Dear ones, we are moving into the Age of Aquarius on December 21st, 2020. This is a powerful cosmic force for the elevation of humanity. Now, not everyone agrees that this is the exact time, but based on previous times of age of transformations, the key indicator of a new age is the time of the great conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn at 0 degrees. Well, then this person goes on to talk about other time periods that when Jupiter and Saturn were at 0 degrees Aries, 0 degrees Pisces. I researched all that, and that's really not the case. And not only that, this individual who wrote this is making the same mistake that many other writers have been making, astrologers, astronomers, and even, wow, one of the guys that I follow, as far as going down to the rabbit holes of what's happening in the world today, there's an interesting guy on YouTube called Adapt 2030. And he has a whole thing on there about the Age of Aquarius, you know, even showing the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction as being the Age of Aquarius. So it's actually out there in the mainstream big time right now. And I think it's really important that we talk about what is kind of like what I'm seeing now is how the sign of Aquarius has hijacked the Age of Aquarius, if I could describe that as an interesting theme for this. So continuing looking at the Facebook post. Owen, if we can go back to that Facebook post. Yeah. Entering the Age of Aquarius is not the same thing as the usual understanding of the sign of Aquarius. Therefore, this conjunction is not about the quote Age of Aquarius. This has been a huge area of research. It's one of the most foundational elements of the paradigm. Just to notice a few things here. The Theosophical Society thought it would begin around the year 1900. I saw many books written in the 1920s in a home library that was in Nevada City, California, heralding the Age of Aquarius in that decade, the 1920s. In 1962, 7 planets in Aquarius heralded the beginning of the Age of Aquarius. According to the book, The Astrological Secrets of the Hebrew Sages, which is a worthy read, it actually, many years ago, was the book that first tuned me into the Great Mutation. That was written quite some time ago, but it talks about New Year's Day of 1981 with the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn at, actually, that's a mistake, at 0. Oh no, at 10 Libra, yeah. Signaled a great mutation, also heralded the beginning of the Age of Aquarius. I, of course, lived through the late 60s and the much hyped dawning of the Age of Aquarius. Innumerable other examples. And now, of course, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius is allegedly yet another indicator. All these examples are missing really important things, which will be delved into in depth next week. I mean, now, okay. Here are a few things to consider. The Jupiter-Saturn conjunction and its great mutation is a big deal, called the Great Chronicles, marker of time. It was the primary way of comprehending long periods of time. until the discovery of the trans-Saturnian planets and a deep awareness of the turning of the ages, first noted in the 1969 book Hamlet's Mill, and then extensively researched by this author and Raymond Mardix in the 1980s. Just how big a deal will be explored now. As a preview, think of the Uranus-Neptune-Pluto conjunction. Amazingly, there is a connection to that. That connection I'll touch on here a little bit, but to be able to fully understand that connection it will probably be what we talk about in more depth and volume in part 2 of this. The Shamanic Astrology Mystery School has suggested the time frame of 1962-2034 is the most useful time frame for the great turning that the planet and global humanity is in now. There have been many indicators of this turning, which in my opinion, the most extraordinary set of circumstances of at least 12,800 years. Now, that of course corresponds to geology, archaeology, anthropology that we now know over the last 5 years, the research showing that there were comet strikes in Canada, Greenland, maybe Siberia, that was one of the things that happened to create the lower Dryas time period. We're then following about 1,200 years of freeze up, worse than the Ice Age. The ocean's rate went up about 300 meters. Huge. I suggest some of the YouTubes we've created to go into that in more detail. And then I also was mentioning that in the night sky, and this is something you can look at now, when you look at the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction right near the entrance into Aquarius, you can see that that Altair, the eye of the eagle, is in alignment with that now. And so therefore we actually have the Eagle constellation in alignment with the sign of Aquarius. Remember, this is not the age of Aquarius indicator. We also want to consider here the actual meaning of the Aquarian water bearer constellation. Do not confuse it with the sign. Now we're going to explore that issue. So let's look at the logo. The logo of our school you're now looking at. This looks complicated, and when you first get into it, it seems complicated, because essentially what shamanic astrology does is it integrates constellational zodiacs, sidereal zodiacs, sign-based zodiacs all into one. And the view of the school for a long period of time, actually even before the school happened, all the way back into the 1980s, is that signs and constellations are completely different. And the problem is that they have been for so long called the same things. So here you can see on the logo, on the outer wheel, are the 12 signs. And then you have the indicators of the constellations with the name that we can attribute, at least in the Western tradition, to those constellational groups. So you'll see that currently, where it says goatfish, if you look at goatfish, it's actually under the sign of Aquarius. The archer is under the sign of Capricorn. The scorpion is under the sign of Sagittarius. And over the course of 26,000 years, every constellation gets to line up with every sign. And it was at the time period of the Hellenistic civilization where they first devised a zodiac based on signs. Before that, it was simply the constellational groups. And the reason in their brilliance that they created a sign-based zodiac was because the constellations had moved away from the seasons that their stories were associated with. there would be a constellation associated with water. There was a whole area of the sky that was associated with water. And that included, if we point at the fish, if we point at the water bear, and if we point at the goatfish, that is an area of the sky that's all water. And interestingly, back at the time period of the origins of the constellational groups that we know, the constellation of Aquarius, one of the oldest constellations that existed, occurred at the time of the December solstice. So if you flip it back, you can line up the solstice point with the water bear, in between the water bear and the goatfish. And it's very interesting that the god Ea, which is the original figure of the constellation Aquarius, is represented by the Sumerians and the Babylonians. And we can come back to this logo in a moment, but Awen, if you can put up maybe the Ea imagery. Here we have an indicator of Ea, the creator god, the water god of the Babylonians, who was a later version of Enki. And Enki in the Sumerian cosmology, here's Enki. Also, you can see the water. So Aquarius was the pourer of water, the water carrier, the water pourer. And actually was, as the creator god, was also called the Lord of the Earth. And if any of you know the stories of the Sumerians and the Babylonians, Enki was the one who loved humanity. And when his brother wanted to destroy humanity, it was actually Enki that saved humanity, from utter, total, complete destruction. But it has to do with the waters of life. It's not air sign Aquarius. It's not the way that the sign Aquarius has been perceived. When the Hellenistic culture invented the seasonal zodiac, which was incredibly important. We could maybe, Awen, go back to the logo. When they invented the signs, it was really important to have that zodiac. And one of the references for our talk today is an article that you can find on the website, and there's a link to it on the Facebook page, why we use the signs and love the constellations. The signs really work, but over a period of time, the constellations inform the signs. So that's an example of why we would have different characteristics of different ages. And our school, for a very long period of time now, we've looked at how the whole thing of when does the age of Aquarius start, which has been the big issue, and which is what inspired this investigation. We believe we solved that question. We came up with what the answer is, which is you have to see a larger framework than simply the movement of a spring equinox point into a sign or a constellation. That is why there are so many different dates for it. For example, in this Facebook post, I listed some of the suggested possibilities, but there's also other possibilities if you use the constellations and if you use precession. My mentor, Dane Ridjar, in some of his writings, said he thought it was 2060. And that was actually based upon what he considered to be the beginning of the Age of Aries. And that is a large speculation about when that was. Many, many different versions of when that was. But then in a later writing, he suggested that it was when the star Regulus began to enter into, or shall we say that the sign of Virgo began to overlay the heart star of the lion. And he thought when he wrote that it was in 2010. We've since discovered it was in early 2012 that occurred. So we actually have talked about that in the school a lot. And also Jung. In Jung's latter writing, in the book The Aeon, he actually uses the stars of the constellation as designed by Ptolemy and by the Greeks, looking at the stars about indicating when the age of Aquarius would begin. And in one of his writings, right before he wrote the book The Aeon, he said it was in 1997, which is not far from our school's version of it, which is that it was 1998. And that had to do with star number 113 in the constellation of Aquarius. He was looking at the actual constellational figure. I know those of you who maybe know this subject, there's screams of outrage. Wait a minute, if we're using the constellation, it's not until 2600 or 2597 or the different dates that have been given by the astronomers. Well, that was when the AAU hijacked the constellations. And they created 88, quote, official constellations. Who are they to do that? And they divided things up. And they hijacked our view of the sky. I even have some inside information that says that when that conference happened in the 1930s, they purposely messed with where Aquarius was to mess with the astrologers. Say, look, we're going to put in this other stuff along the ecliptic. We're going to put in Ophiuchus along the ecliptic, and then we can make Aquarius be much longer or much later in time. It's purposely done by the astronomers, and many astrologers have bought into this. But that's a whole other story. So let's just go back to the logo for a moment. This logo can be used to discern 26,000 years and what would be the nature of the different ages. So what I want to point out here in this portion of our conversation, this is the situation right now. And so what are these 4 red lines? By the way, Awen, I want to thank you for creating this beautiful device about how we can illustrate our logo in a better way. So here we have the signs, and with the quadrant lines are showing how the seasonal year is divided. You know, so we basically have the north. We have the equinoxes and the solstices. And so we see here the spring equinox point, the vernal equinox, the Aries equinox, which is right there. And you can see it's like right in between the stars of the fish and the stars of the water bearer. Now, if our whole attention is only placed on that, that's how you can have 100 different possibilities of when is the age of Aquarius beginning. Whether you use whatever we think the age of Aries started, and then 2100 years, 2148 years, 2160 years later, then you come up with a date. Or you can use the actual stars to determine the end and the beginning of that sign. But as, that constellation, and then that sign. But as we discussed, even as far back in the 1980s, it's very possible that this whole deal of what is the age of Aquarius is entirely a moot question, because it's actually all 4 are moving at the same time. So if you look at where the Capricorn Sag signs are, which is where the December solstice is, look, it's in between the Archer and the Scorpion. And it's also where galactic center is. If you can see where the bow and arrow is pointing to the line. You can maybe point that out there. Yeah, beautiful, right. And then you can see also the turning down at the bottom between the twins and the bull. And there you have the point of 0 Cancer. That is to say, the June solstice. And then we go over to the far right there. In between the signs of Libra and Virgo, we find the priestess and the lion. And that is exactly what Rajara was talking about when the star, which was the heart of the lion, moved into the sign of Virgo, not the other, yes, right, that would actually be the beginning of the Aquarian age. So the whole kinds of different possibilities. But we think we came up with the answer. The Galactic Alignment. The Galactic Alignment, which occurred center point 1998. It's beyond the scope of this conversation to go deeply into the cosmology of that. We actually have a 5-day course on it, and we also have the online course on it. It actually does require a fair amount of background to fully get this. But the point here would be that all 4 ages turn, and it's on a bigger clock than does it just move into the quote, the age of Aquarius. It's 4 ages that turn about every 2100 years. 2148, some say, 2160, some say. So the ages turned in 1998. So we're actually, if we're totally focused in on what is the age of Aquarius based on what the constellations, that's already happened. It happened in 1998, but we're in a zone which is from 1962 to 2034. We came up with that because that's 72 years, and the precessional cycle is 1 degree every 72 years. So we're in the zone. And if you look back to 1962, many things have happened that people have gotten, wow, this is it, you know, 2012, the millennium, there's 5 or 6 different really major events that have happened since 1962 that people said, that's it, this is the beginning of the new age. So maybe it's now that I've really established some foundation on this, which can certainly bring up a lot of questions. And actually, the questions that maybe come up are maybe even Mary and Awen might have. This might be a time period for us to pause for a moment to see where we're at the moment before getting into the topic of what Jupiter and Saturn and Aquarius is really about.
Well, one question that's coming to my mind is everybody's searching for when the age of Aquarius begins. Is there some historical biblical passage or something that says when we enter the age of Aquarius something will happen? Are we looking for this shift in ages? Is there something that you know that references?
Oh yeah, I mean all over the place. Actually, that's one of the important points regarding the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, because in this book, the Astrological Secrets of the Hebrew Sages, they're talking about how, like the Magi and the whole story of the astronomers that were associated from the time of Babylon onward, in the Jewish esoteric tradition, they were looking at the Jupiter-Saturn cycle to indicate when the Messiah would come. And so they were trying to come up with using the Jupiter-Saturn as the great chronicler, you know, the only things they could use to determine the larger cycles to indicate when the new age would be. So that there's that version of it, absolutely. And then there is also the esoteric story that I have shared in the school in the past about this longed for Aquarian dispensation. And what the Aquarian dispensation, this goes back to stories told 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, that when we could say the Sophia and Christos hierarchies fell into we could say dominator consciousness. As the Kali Yuga started coming in, as the old traditions died, the elites were no longer good people. Everything turned around. The sovereignty concept of royalty and bloodlines and so on got really corrupted. Their view was that there would be a point, and this was their understanding of the true Age of Aquarius, when it would not be the return of Christ. It would not be the establishment of the old bloodlines. It would not be the return of how it had been before, but it would actually be the great dispensation of Aquarius, that we all are the Christ. We all have the capacity of being sovereign and free and enlightened and connected to our divinity. That was the Aquarian dispensation, which is when the bloodlines of the elite would be spread to everyone. And so that's the idealism of the actual Age of Aquarius, not what we're talking about as this, the shadow of the sign of Aquarius, the technology and the fake unity that I've spoken of in the past. So that there's the waters of life idea. Aquarius, the Aquarian thing is about heart and humanity and freedom and sovereignty. You know, it is, after all, the opposite, the resonant polarity with Leo. And, you know, we would go back, you know, 6,500 years when basically 13,000 years, when you have the mirror image, you know, so you would have the lion rising in the east, and now we have the water bearer rising in the east. But the key factor is to not get stuck on this false equivalency, that the Age of Aquarius has anything to do with our belief about the sign of Aquarius. The sign of Aquarius has a meaning. It was specifically devised in the seasonal zodiac, the sign-based zodiac, as having a specific meaning. It's air. And it's a lot of the stuff we know about the sign of Aquarius is actually, it works. It's work. Of all the things we can say about Aquarius, the sign, it definitely has essence. But that ain't the Age of Aquarius. The Age of Aquarius is a different thing, and to confuse them is just going to take people completely off track. Did I answer your question there on that, Awen?
Yeah, well, I guess I'm just wondering if there's specifically a mention of an Aquarian age anywhere that is what is like prophesized or something. Like, why is it specifically Aquarius that everybody is searching for us entering, when it seems that there could be other ages that we could be talking about? I mean, I know the stories of like the age of the ram started with you know, biblical stories and that sort of thing. Is that the basis that everyone is searching for the Age of Aquarius based on?
Well, you're really speaking to the heart of the issue. Even all the way back in the 1980s, myself and Mardix were always talking about how that to put the emphasis on the spring equinox and the movement of the spring equinox into a constellation makes you a spring equinox chauvinist, if I could put it that way. When in fact, what we try to point out is that there's four turning all the time. So that if we placed our attention on the winter solstice, you know, the December solstice, you could have and only astrologers like Robert Hand and even Jung in his latter years as an astrologer talk about this, you know, the movement of these other points into constellations, not just only talking about the spring equinox. It's fascinating because this issue even comes up when we begin to dive more deeply into the Great Mutation. Because even Kelly Phipps And I want to bring him into the story right now. And I really want to give a huge amount of props to Kelly Lee Phipps. And I want to thank Gemini Brett for bringing this to my attention. Kelly Lee Phipps wrote this astounding 60-page document that you can get from his website for $5. And boy, is it ever worth it for $5. It's called the Elemental Wave Chronicles, the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. Unbelievable research. Unfortunately, Kelly Lee Phipps passed away in 2013. He wrote this in 2011. He actually interviewed me at a NORWAC conference, and you can actually see those interviews online. I think they're out there still, probably on YouTube somewhere. But he was quite a polymath. I mean, he really researched a great deal, and it's definitely worth taking it in if you want to know about the Great Mutation. Now, I think he was missing information. He did not have exactly the same view of the turning of the ages as we do in SAMS. He wasn't aware of the fourth turning. He wasn't aware of the more recent research on the Kali Yuga. But boy, does he ever have this sorted out. And you can look at this. We're going to go into this in more detail in part 2 of our vlogcast here. But you can see here, 1981, 2000. These are the different 800-year waves of the Jupiter-Saturn process. But back to your question, though. You could make a case that, and in fact, some parts of the world don't place the same emphasis on the spring equinox. All right, and even our secular calendar now is January 1st. You know, it's not like March, although, you know, that with the calendar changed, even the names of our months, you know, I don't know if you ever thought about this, is that, you know, December means 10th month. March comes from Mars, you know, which is coming from the Aries, March, first month, right? So that's the remnant of the fact that for longer time periods in history in the Western world, we were, you know, focused on the spring equinox, the spring equinox chauvinism. So yeah, so then you have the age of the bull, the age of the ram, the age of the twins, the age of the fish, and now the age of the water bear. So that's why that emphasis was placed there. But I made a comment earlier that at the time of the Sumerians, and when they invented the Aquarian constellation, I mean, it might have been there way before, but at least that's when we have records of it. There is speculation that maybe the stuff in Göbekli Tepe has the old ancient earlier constellational glyphs. But anyway, for sure, we know that the Aquarian constellation was used by the Sumerians. It was Enki and Ea, anyway, at that time period, that constellation was at the December solstice. So you could have, and they were obviously seeing that as important. And the reason they were saying it was important is there was flooding that happened, and that very same idea came about when the Egyptians borrowed the constellations, you know, and they brought them in, you know, and they equated it with the flooding of the Nile. The association of these constellations with times and the seasons, and the fact that in precession it changes, so the constellation will show up at a different season, is what caused the Greeks to create the signs. So that you had a framework, a reference that was not based on the constellations moving relative to the seasons. And so in shamanic astrology, we take into account both the zodiacs. So your question about, you know, the age of Aquarius, well, more recently, of course, as more people became aware of the turning of the ages, or the different ages, and with that emphasis all went on the, you know, the emphasis on the spring equinox. Well, of course, it's like, when does the age of Aquarius start? You know, people wanted to move into a new age. And so the whole imagery of new age, and hey, I know it just dates me a lot, but God, in the late 60s, early 70s, early 70s, I would go to these Gnostic society meetings, and this Romanian guy who was teaching about Gnosticism used to say, "The New Age is old hat." In other words, even then, there was skepticism about the hijacking of the concept of the New Age. See, so it's been going on for a long time. And I do believe that a lot of the sign of Aquarius material is mistakenly used for the movement into the age of Aquarius, which is water. And it's so that it's really not this whole technology thing. It's not this fake unity kind of stuff. Now I want to just also give props for a moment. And I was when I started going down these rabbit holes, I did find a rather useful and but it was well done article by Ray Merriman. If I can find where the heck I put it. He wrote it at the end of 2019, before the whole COVID, or what I sometimes call convid thing, started. But he definitely believed very strongly in the, this whole article he wrote, it was on the Jupiter-Saturn Great Mutation. But then he equated it with the Aquarian age. And he was giving, this was his prediction for what was going to happen in 2020. Very, very fascinating. A new era of world leadership and the emergence of bold new leaders espousing themes such as social justice. Remember, he wrote this in 2019, okay? Greater liberties and rights for individuals via new laws and the abolishment of old repressive laws. Yikes. That sounds like Aquarian projection to me. Does that look like what's happening? But then there's some other stuff here that's really curious and interesting. The period may start with social upheavals, even revolutions, in which current leaders are either voted out of office or removed forcibly. Maybe. And certainly, a lot of that is true. Inquisitions and investigations increase early in this period. Well, what about the inquisitions and investigations? There's a lot of investigations, but the Inquisition is like the censoring of the internet, which you know, it's basically like the Alexandria book burnings on a much larger scale. Collective values begin to change, transitioning the status given to personal accumulated wealth towards the expression of intellectual, creative, and artistic endeavors. That's certainly not what the sustainability and global reset has in mind. Nice thoughts, very Aquarian projection there. The rise of socialism, or a hybrid of socialism over capitalism as a base of economic and governmental structures. Oh, the digital dollar, the cancel currency. Oh, interesting. The rise in prominence of China on the world stage. Oh my God, we're going to be talking about that, and I have been talking about that over the last year, but in the solstice time, Kaylin and I will be discussing that again, the chart of China, which is 3 Aquarius, 1 Aquarius, the moon and the ascendant. So China represents the Saturn-Jupiter Great Mutation in the sign of Aquarius. I ain't going to say that represents the age of Aquarius. So I want to really make a distinction again between those two concepts. Because I believe that if you superimpose the shadow of the sign of Aquarius onto the age of Aquarius, then you get the fake unity stuff. You know, you get the let's put everybody into the Borg, into a hive. You know, everybody says, well, Aquarius, the sign, is a collective sign. It certainly is a collective sign, but it's also been associated with mob rule. You know, it's been associated with the the revolution eating its, eating the makers of the revolution. So there's a whole lot to sort out here. So I'm going to turn it back over to see what questions thoughts that are coming up for Mary and Awen before we actually do the last part of the vlog today, which is about the Christmas star, which I thought would be interesting to put in here before we get to the solstice and Christmas itself. Yes, Awen.
Well, so just to summarize real quick, I'm sure Mary has a question. I just want to summarize what you're saying is based on what we've uncovered in the school, we are indeed at a new age based on galactic alignments and
yes,
things that are completely unrelated to any of the signs or even our idea of shifting into the even constellation of Aquarius. But there is a major 800-year cycle shifting now with this Jupiter and Saturn conjunction that does involve the sign of Aquarius.
That brings me to my question. How is the movement of the three major planets into the seasonal sign of Aquarius? That's Jupiter and Saturn this month on the 17th and the 19th of December, and then Pluto in 2024. How is that tied into this? And how is that different from the popularly held belief of what we've called the Age of Aquarius? And I'm sure that will segue us, when you answer that, into maybe the Christmas star.
Well, actually, that question that you're asking here could be thought of as the opening questions for part 2 of our vlog, because it requires looking at the way in which the ancients, including these guys and the article of the research of Kelly Lee Phipps and others, which has to do with the cycle itself of the Great Mutation. And you have these 800-year time periods. Actually, it's 794.4, which it's 40 different Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions. Take it back to the starting point.
794.4 years is what you said earlier.
794.4, yeah. And so therefore, that takes us back to 1226.
Right.
And 1226 has been brought up by many other people as the time period of the closest. We have to go back to 1226 to have the closest Jupiter-Saturn conjunction as the one we're having coming up on the 21st. And then you go back another 794 years, you go back another 794 years, and it's a marvelous way of seeing different time periods in history. And one of the things I'm deeply researching right now is how that corresponds to what Rajar thought was one of the great turning points in our history, which is when Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were conjunct. And then how that was back in 577 BC. And then you connect that in with the Great Mutation cycle, and you can see the astounding stuff that was happening in world history in 500, 400 BC in that time period. That's a very rare triple conjunction, and as you would weave that together with the Great Mutation, you can come up with a different version of the Great Ages. Now, let me just cut to a different thing for a moment. So, because the Christian transmission has had such a large effect on the West, and actually to a certain extent the whole world, it was kind of assumed that you had to start with the element of fire. And the reason for that was that Christ, at the time period of what they assumed it to be the Great Mutation, starting a new age, was just before Jupiter and Saturn moved into the fire time period, of where it was going to have a long run in fire. So it was like the last water one happened followed by fire. I mean, the way that the whole thing works is that you would have the sequence of elements, which is the same sequence as the way the signs work, you know, so water to fire to earth to air to water to fire to earth to air, you know, so like we've been for like many hundreds of years in earth, and it's moving into air. Now, the Christian view on this would be you begin an age when it moves into fire. So they thought basically the birth of Christ was the beginning of an age. And even Kelly Lee Phipps goes back to 3000 year BC and starts it with fire. And we'll go into that in greater detail. But here's what I've been speculating about, which is that here we are for sure in the middle of the turning of the ages, like the end and the beginning of a 26,000 year cycle, which would then correspond to what the Hebrew sages referred to as the divine conjunction. That is to say, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction to begin an entire great year. Now, that would not be the case now if you put your attention on fire, that it had to be a fire Jupiter-Saturn. This is air. First degree of Aquarius. Now, so therefore, what it is I'm trying to say, because if you follow along with what I'm trying to get into here, it sounds like, and I, in a sense I am, I'm debunking this Age of Aquarius stuff, questioning that we're imposing onto the Age of Aquarius stuff about the sign of Aquarius. Yet at the same time, I'm suggesting that this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in Aquarius, occupying this time, happening in this time period of the end and the beginning of a whole great year, a 26,000 year cycle, this is really a big deal. This is maybe the actual great chronometer indicating that it is a complete turn of the wheel. So it is like one of the most marvelous examples of the birth of a, quote, new age. I mean, a 26,000 year new age. But that's not to be confused with the sign of Aquarius, you know. So what it's really about is the big four, you know, because it's the movement of the equinoxes and the solstices into the big four. The bull, the lion, the you know, the scorpion, which in some transitions they saw, traditions they saw as the eagle. That's the sort of Ezekiel Daniel one. And then the water bearer. The water bearer, you know, it's one of the big four. When we're moving into that as one of the four, quote, new ages. But that's water, that's land, that's the creator God, that's humanity, that's the heart and the soul of humanity. That ain't technology.
And
that's
Daniel,
not. Yes, Mary.
then it's also self-exploration from a time that was very much based on taking the culture forward. So, I mean, if you tie that together with the Aquarian dispensation, I think there's a connection there between finding one's divinity and realizing that, and self-exploration, which are the signs that we're turning
those four.
into.
Yeah. Actually, what you're reminding me of there, beautiful, is that in the investigation of this, and I give again props here to Ray Merriman for bringing it up, and Kelly Lee Phipps mentions it a bit too. What was happening? What was the main Aquarian kind of thing that was happening 800 years ago? Very important thing. And I think it's the kind of inspiration that we can get from what humans were up to back then. It was then that the Magna Carta happened. And the Magna Carta, at least in the Western tradition, was the first time that people stood up against the the elitism of the royal family, the royals, and they created the Magna Carta, the great charter for the rights of man. which inspired the the American and French Revolution. So there is that version of Jupiter and Saturn in Aquarius that I want to advocate for here. But that's, again, the more idealistic view of what the water bearer represents and what Jung writes about and what the Christian original tradition was about, of what is coming out of the water jar. It's basically the waters of life. It's not some kind of fake technological unity, but rather it is this thing you're mentioning, Mary, which is, of course, the sovereignty, the divinity, the freedom, which goes back to what I thought was one of the greatest ideals of the, quote, New Age in the late 60s. A whole different way of seeing the, quote, sign of Aquarius, actually, which is be your archetype, the freedom to be everything we can be, and to not fit into some kind of, sameness, unity is not sameness, it's diversity in unity. And that brings us back around to Rajar's understanding of the whole thing, which we're at a time period called the planetarization of consciousness. Now, to me, that is really what the New Age is, the planetarization of consciousness. And that includes the Earth and her animals and plants and humans and, the Earth herself, the planetarization of consciousness, which is what he saw was the synthesis that happened from the time of, 400 or 500 BC. All right, I know we've gone long here, so let's turn our attention to the Christmas star possibilities. So one of the versions of this, which was espoused by the astrological secrets of the Hebrew sages, as well as a lot of other writers, including Kelly Lee Phipps, is that the herald of the New Age was the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 7 BC. And that was the one that, in fact, let's look at what happened there. We can pick really any of the ones in 7 BC. There was a triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn 3 different times in 7 BC. And you can see there one of them, May 29th, 7 BC, Jupiter and Saturn, 20 Pisces. Now, what's very interesting about that, of course, is that at that time period, the sign of Pisces was really close to the boundary of the, it was like right, you can imagine, okay, New Age, it's right there in Pisces. But then it was, if you look at it in the sky, it's the cord, which is anyway, it's the ram and the fish are like really close together at that point. It's like the whole thing that needs to be researched more about the Great Mutation as it applies to the sidereal, to the stars, because we're really just talking about signs right here. And then that was followed by the entrance of the Great Mutation into fire. So they said, this is the herald of the Messiah. Now, whether that 7 BC event that happened 3 times was the Christmas star or not is in dispute, because there's actually something that happened a few years later where Venus and Jupiter created a mutual occultation. Here we have, this is the one from August 12th. A moment. We actually want to look at the one from June 17th, 2 BC. So this is when there was what's called a mutual occultation. In other words, where Venus and Jupiter merged. They were seen as one star. On this particular date, June 17th, 2 BC, you can see Venus and Jupiter at 8 Leo. There's no longer a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. That would have been about 5 years before. And this would have been in the evening sky. That is, it would be toward the west. So how does the Christmas story go, right? You know, it's like whether you use the biblical version of it, of the Magi, who were astronomers, astrologers, who were astrologers, and you know, they would have known about the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, and they see the star appearing. And how does the song go? Westward leading, still proceeding. You know, we three kings of the Orient are. You know so basically, they're following a star toward the west, east to west. So here we have Venus and Jupiter during that time period in the evening sky. And on that particular day, they form a single point. Mutual occultation. Now, there are other people. This is, of course, quite a controversial issue. You know, there's different views of what would the Christmas star have been. It might have been the Jupiter-Saturn triple conjunction in 7 BC. Some say it was a comet, although I've not seen conclusive evidence that a great comet happened in those years. Maybe it did. Actually, Kepler, who most popularized in more recent times the Jupiter-Saturn Great Mutation, what inspired him to even get into it was the arrival of that supernova that happened in 1604 that blew his mind, you know, and that caused the church to go against astrology, because here was something that happened that was against the natural order. Kepler was someone who helped have the church go against astrology, actually, because he spoke out in ways that were against their doctrines. Anyway, and it's also possible that it was something else, you know, and it's also, of course, possible that it never happened at all. It's just a nice story. But for sure, I like this date a lot. Venus, Jupiter, mutual occultation, evening sky. Just interesting. And obviously, our talk today is designed to stimulate imagination, openness, curiosity, inquiry, and we're going to continue on with this. My view these days is question everything about all of this. And maybe as a final thing for us to discuss, since this will be our last blog before the solstice call and before Christmas, that is to talk about just briefly all the stuff in the air right now, and to be able to sort out what part of it is an Aquarian sign projection and what part of it is really the possibility of a great new age, of what happens at a great turning. And always remembering that in our school, it's a three-world approach. To not go completely gung-ho into this all, you know, lollipops and roses. It could also actually be the sixth mass extinction. You know, what happens? We know those things have happened in the past. So we do have the underworld view. We have the middle world realistic view, which includes the shadow of Aquarius, the sign that is. And then we have the larger sense of the waters of life, you know, the creator God, or goddess. I mean, basically, I don't want to get caught up into identity politics here, but, you know, at least for the Sumerians and the Babylonians, Aquarius was a, quote, God figure. But I have no problem with putting you know, different goddesses pouring the water. You know, I think that's Kuan Yin also, right? So Kuan Yin could be thought of as a synthesis symbol of sort of like the sign of Pisces and the sign of Aquarius. You know, those two together. The waters of compassion, a different kind of unity of the heart and soul of humans and the planet. All right.
And the
Mary.
water, yes, and that's definitely how I see the water, as a feeling function. And this this transition from realizing that you can't answer everything with the mind through the thinking mind, which has been very much brought us to the point that we're at with the materialism and possessions and the American dream. But that whole, what really the healing comes from the heart. And the energy medicine that I've been studying is all about connecting through the heart and calling in scalar energy, which is flowing streams of grace. And it is a very real thing, and it is through the air, and it basically is being used to heal. And it is free, and it is easy, and it's, to me, that is the big transition that if we will make the biggest difference, is learning how to use our own divinity in that way.
So that is the Aquarian dispensation, together with sovereignty, autonomy, and with the waters of life, and the energy that connects humanity through the heart, not through some sort of Borg-like digitalization. I mean, maybe my final thoughts on this are that I believe that the true, this is my view now, this is not like some official agenda of the Shamanic Astrology Mystery School, this is my own view, which is that the ultimate violation of the Age of Aquarius by the shadow of the sign of Aquarius is the digitalization of everything. Because the brain and humans are not digital. You know, we're organic beings, and I mean, that to me is the violation that needs to be exposed. So, any final comments from you, Awen, before we close this off?
No, I think we're covered everything.
We certainly welcome feedback on this, and then the feedback will go into part 2, volume 2 on this. And I do want to maybe add to, well, make sure we put this in the article that I include with the newsletter, a way for people to get the remarkable research of Kelly Lee Phipps that needs to be followed up on here at this point. And to all the other investigators out there that have been looking into the Great Mutation and willing to actually look at the larger story we're talking about, that Age of Aquarius is not the sign of Aquarius. And okay, we'll talk to you all next at our solstice event. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Good night.
Mm-hmm.